First of all, I'd like to thank, first of all of you coming, but also Mike and the team for inviting me. And he's absolutely right. I will mention Charles because his book has some influence on this as well. So I'll start. Let's just do that. Yeah. So what I'm going to do is today to go through the introduction and discovery. So how did I come across the old boy? What was his role in the American Civil War? His amazing life, and really focusing on the American Civil War and his part in it. Right. So who was he? He was born in 1815 and died age 61 in 1877. And I had no idea of him until I started doing my family tree. And to my utter amazement, I found that his diaries were in the National Maritime Museum here in Greenwich. And it took me 6 years to transcribe all that he'd written. And I haven't really completely finished yet. But it was all unpublished work. Some guy down in Bristol said, "Oh, can I write his biography? I want to write the life and times of Lindsay." Well, a hell of a lot happened between 1815 and 1877. And after about 6 months, he'd written about a chapter. And he said it'd probably take about 3 or 4 books. And so it's pretty obvious I was going to have to do it myself. So, and obviously this was the first stab. I had no idea of how about going about it. Incidentally, I just retired. I had 35 years in pharmaceuticals, so it had nothing to do with history at all. This is all self-learnt over a period of time. So a true amateur. He was born in Ayr in 1815, and he actually came from a pretty poor family. 1854, he owned 22 ships and had 700 per year. Which he chartered as a ship's broker. He was a bit like Branson of his day in many respects. He was very well known. And by 1856, he'd become an MP. So he was moving amongst the great and good. Yeah. So in his diaries, he wrote about the great and good. So anyone up on here, he has anecdotes about, ranging from Lincoln to Paxton to Dickens, 4 prime ministers, Napoleon, and I'll talk about that, the president, Buchanan, all these people, he's got anecdotes in his diaries. It was just amazing. You just sort of carry on transcribing and another famous person would leap out. Okay, so this is what was said by 2 eminent authors. First of all, Duncan Campbell's book. Lindsay MP became the leading Confederate spokesman in Parliament. And then Frank Murley, Lindsay was almost like an unofficial Confederate representative in Napoleon's court. So when I read that, I thought, well, he must have had a pretty big task and role in recognition for the state, for the Confederate states. So when I was looking at doing the book, I split his life into 7 different chapters or parts, and the American Civil War obviously came latterly. So he was born in Ayr in Scotland at his uncle's house, and this is his uncle, Reverend William Schaw. So remember, he was brought up by his reverend, and he had a sense of Christianity. He was orphaned aged 10. His father had died aged 4 through drink because he was a failed businessman. His mother died aged 10 when he was 10, and so he was brought up from then by his uncle. But he ran away to sea age 16. He didn't want to put on his uncle an arm. By the age of 25, that's 9 years later, he'd become a ship's captain, and he had several near-death experiences, which I'll touch on. So he ran away to sea from Glasgow down to Liverpool. And he was given £5 by his uncle, which was promptly stolen by someone who befriended him. So he had 2 shillings and 6pence. So he went down to Liverpool docks and it took him 7 weeks of repeatedly going to ships to try and get a job. And that actually put a lot of, come back to the American Civil War, that experience really coloured his life in many ways. He was begging, he had no shelter, obviously no job, and he was quite destitute. So that was a big learning experience. Anyway, he joined as after 7 weeks as an apprentice. He's one of 4 apprentices on an ocean-going ship, which went down from the UK down to Georgetown in the West Indies, where Demerara sugar. Okay, and I had no idea about this, but actually the ships went up to Canada to get timber to make the barrels to hold the sugar in. Then after a while, he became second mate, and again sailed to the West Indies. Later on, he was second in command of another ship going out to Calcutta and the Far East, and then finally a captain of the Olive Branch. And he had near-death experiences, and I'll just explain. I mean, they're very vivid in his diaries. But in yellow fever, in West Indies, yellow fever was rife in the 1830s and 40s. And he says that of a crew of 31, 16 had died within 4 weeks. And in his diaries, he mentions about in hammocks, one side, his companion dying on that side, and another companion dying on the other side. So he managed to escape that. He was at one stage as a captain. He was tasked by the East India Company to take some specie or some treasure, etc., from Calcutta to Arabia, and he was attacked transporting the goods, and the Arab came at him and slashed him across the chest. He took out his pistol, he shot the guy, but he didn't know whether he killed him because they had to scarp. And then dangers at sea. I mean, in the 1830s, it's very difficult to sort of understand what it was like. But if you think about it, harbours were like a sea of forests. There was no cars, no trains, no planes. It was either, carts and carriages, or the sea, boats. And if you imagine sailing in winter, and there are loads of episodes in his diaries about this, which I put in the book, about either falling off in icy weather during the winter, and then people would go overboard, and a lot of sailors didn't actually swim in those days. So, it was death if you fell off. He broke his bones very badly on one escapade, and there's loads of other things there as well. One of his companions was cast adrift, but they managed to find him. This was up in Newfoundland. And that was the ship that he was captain of, the Olive Branch. So after 9 years, he thought, right, I've had enough of the sea. I'm going to go and change my career. And the captain, well, the ship company owned a colliery in the northeast of England, and offered him a job as a coal agent in Hartlepool. And I'll go through this quickly. He got married. He set up a ship's brokerage in London, and this was providing coal for P&O and other miners. His son was born, and I'll mention very briefly auxiliary steamers, which was one of the ways he actually earned a fortune. So in the colliery, this is Castle Eden Colliery in the northeast. He was, as I mentioned, an agent there, and because he was quite important in the company, there was a miners' strike in 1844, and he was tasked to turf out miners out of their houses if they didn't go back to work. And he said that that was the day most unsatisfactory of my life. And again, it's a learning experience for him. He had to do that. Again, it's all described in the book. And then he met his wife, Helen Stewart, who became his wife, Helen Lindsay. Helen had a sister called Christine and a brother called Robert. Robert was quite well known in Glasgow because he was quite eminent in the council there. And in fact, a fountain at Kelvin Grove is in his memory because he arranged to transport fresh water from one of the lochs to Glasgow, which significantly improved people's health there. Now, the interesting thing is, amazingly, in his diaries, he mentions on 2 occasions that I might have married the wrong sister. He really fancied Christine, and there's loads of stories to that effect in his papers. Whilst he was up there in Hartlepool, they didn't have a lighthouse, and his house where he was right on the edge of the cliff. And one particular episode, the ship got grounded against the reefs and completely broke up. He describes it vividly. And the last person was clinging onto the mast, holding the woman, and he surmised that that was the captain and the wife. And then that fell over too, and they perished. And from that moment, he was determined to get a lighthouse. And he was in his mid-20s now, and so he was really unpopular with the council because he really lobbied hard to get this done. They didn't like this Scotsman who's in his mid-20s coming along and telling them what to do. But to cut a long story short, he managed to get that done, and there was a lighthouse in his name there. Then he moved to London, and the second place was because the first had increased significantly in numbers of people managing the business because business was going so well. And what he hit on was supplying coal to the liners, to ships. And remember here, we're talking about the transition from sail to steam. And so the early steamers, P&O and West India Steam Company, wanted coal. Now, it was specific coal that was very efficient in engines because the engines weren't that effective then. Later on, they had the compound engine, which was much better. But the early phase, the engines were pretty crude, and they needed really good coal to work from. And that came from Wales. So he had to prove that the northeast coal was as good as the Welsh coal, which he managed to do. The other thing that was interesting was that shipbrokers in London in those days, by and large, were financiers. They were managing money. But because he was knowledgeable about the sea, they came to him because he was speaking their language, and his business just completely boomed. He married his wife, and they had a son, my namesake, funnily enough, and I knew nothing about that. And then in 1852, he launched his first ship, which he called the W.S. Lindsay, as you do. And this was up in Newcastle upon Tyne, and this is the launch that was in the Illustrated News. Now, to give you an idea, it's about the same size as the Cutty Sark. It's not a small ship, it's a big ship, very similar. And the Cutty Sark was built 17 years later. So he was really quite early on. Now, notice this was a sailing ship. He converted it to a small steam engine later, but it was a sailing ship to start off with. That's an important point, because in those days, ship owners either had to stick with sail and improve that with clippers and things like that, or go into fully powered steamers, the likes of Brunel doing that with engines to run through coal on the steamer, or an auxiliary. And this is where Lindsay made his fortune as well, because what he did was to get a conventional sailing ship, convert it with a small engine to get them out of trouble, in calm waters and in harbours and things like that. Problem with fully powered steamers is that because the engines were so inefficient, the cargo hold was tended to be full of coal, which meant that there was little room for cargo and little room for passengers. So these weren't that effective at all commercially, whereas this was doing really well. For about 10 years, it hit on a really good subject. And I was just Googling along W.S. Lindsay, and this came. And this is a painting in the Swedish Maritime Museum in Stockholm. And these are 11 of his ships. They're all his ships. And the lady archivist there said, do you realize the size of the painting? I said, no. And that's my wife and I with the painting. It's absolutely massive. So again, I mean, this must have been in his house at one stage. And how it went to Stockholm, I have no idea. So anyway, he was making a lot of money. He decided, right, I'm going to go into politics. His experience in the Northeast, getting the lighthouse built, he thought, right, I'm going to do something to help on this. And first of all, he went for Monmouth down in Wales, and it was full of corruption. The guy there was Crawshaw Bailey. He was the Tory. Lindsay was a Liberal. And Crawshay Bailey, he was an owner of a coal and iron ore company down in Wales. And basically he said to his workers, if you don't vote for me, then you're out. So there was a lot of corruption there. So Lindsay didn't get in. The second thing he went to was Dartmouth, and he was up against the Admiral, and there was all sorts of shenanigans going on there as well. So he didn't get in. But third time lucky, in Tynemouth in 1854, as a radical Liberal, he won by 17 votes. Now remember, there's no women here. It's votes for men only. And again, those that can pay their way to be able to vote. So the numbers are small, 350 odd in each camp, if you like. So he decided, right, I'm going to go into the House and I'm determined that I should speak on something that I know about, which is shipping. So by and large, that's what he did. At the same time, the Crimea war kicked off, and his ships were involved in transport ships. I'll explain about divers with explosives, and he was heavily critical of the Admiralty. So one of his ships, Robert Lowe, transported the famous Nightingale, Florence Nightingale. When they arrived out in the Crimea, she didn't have any headquarters or anything, so they allowed her to stay on the ship for 2 weeks to organise what she had to do out in Crimea. He had built in Scotland this ship, and it had an infrastructure on the deck. The Admiralty came along, the surveyor, and said it was top heavy. So they took an axe to it and cut all the top bit off, which really annoyed him. And that was the start of his sort of angst against the Admiralty. Now, just a quick word about these explosives. His ships carried 13 of these explosives in the ships. And the reason for that was the Russians had sunk ships to block the harbour. Now, this is interesting because this is what happened in the Crimea, in the American Civil War as well, because there the same thing happened. Ships sunk to block harbours. And actually, only a couple of months ago, the Russians, with the Turk Bridge, I think it is, in Crimea, they did the same thing a couple of months ago, sinking ships so that Ukrainians can come. So history repeats itself. Anyway, these were meant to be taken down by divers to blow up the sunken ships. It didn't work because the two forts, the Russians were just able to fire upon the boats that were carrying out this episode. But the thing that really annoyed him was the mismanagement. To give you an idea, tables were sent out to Crimea without legs, boots were requisitioned but were already out there. A regiment in South Africa that was requisitioned, they want to move them to the Crimea. The ship went out there because there was no paperwork in order, they couldn't transport them. And then 3,000 horses were waiting for ships. The Admiralty said it'll probably take about 3 months. Lindsay knew he could do it in 3 weeks. And all this because the Royal Navy, meticulous as they were, they didn't carry much in the way of any inventory. Whereas, of course, in merchant shipping, Lindsay, his ships, what was there, when was it being carried, when was it going to arrive, etc., etc. So because of that, he was involved in the Administration Reform Association. About 40 MPs joined, and in fact, not only MPs, but Dickens joined as well. And they really threatened the government at the time. It was a small group, they wanted reform. So what did the government do? They promoted these three, and the problem went away. I think, again, history repeats itself with politics. So this only lasted about 6 months and then it folded. But a message had gone across. So very briefly now, a bit more about shipping and his ships, because after the Crimean War they lay dormant, he decided, right, what am I going to do with them? And this is one of his ships, the RMS England. He'd set up with the government a mail shipping line out to South Africa and India, and 6 of his ships went out there. But the South Africans weren't playing ball. They didn't want to pay a slightly higher premium for an auxiliary steamer compared to a sailing ship. And after a year, he thought, right, I'm not playing ball anymore, and it folded. I did read in one book, actually, that he called it the WSL line, and one wag in one of the books said, the worst shipping line. Anyway, right. And then before this, we're nearly at the American Civil War now. So his ships also were involved in emigration. And this is a lady called Caroline Chisholm. She was famous for shipping out females out to Australia because gold had happened there and there were surplus of men, significantly so. And again, in her diary, she says that Lindsay was a leader in emigration, sending out 5,000 to 6,000 people out to Australia for her. And then another group went out to Canada, again because of gold and a surplus of men, and 2 of his ships went out and they were known as bride ships. Right, now, at last, so I'll just touch through these things. US tour, cause of the war, recognition, building the Navy, blockade, and visits to the Emperor. So, shortly before the American Civil War started, in 1860, September 1860, he went out to give talks on navigation laws to a lot of the ports in the northern states. And when I say navigation laws, I'm talking about things like, well, what happens if someone absconds or deserts in the Navy? And there was a disconnect between America and the British, and he wanted to try and have some sort of commonality as to what to do with the likes of that. So he went and gave a talk at these various places, including a place in Springfield, where he had dinner with the president-elect, Abraham Lincoln. There's a whole story about that. It's obviously Abraham's house. And he describes it in some detail. Amazingly, a lot of his MP colleagues said, right, you're going out to the States, we're thinking of investing money in the railroad. Can you go on the railroad and see if it's going to be worthwhile investing in? And from Chicago to St. Louis, he went on the train journey there, and he was amazed to see the potential of the States, particularly in wheat and everything else. And he wrote back basically saying, yes, go ahead and invest, it's definitely worth doing. But the guy that escorted him train was the epitome of a Dickens guy. He was dressed in a loud outfit. He was spitting tobacco, sort of cockeyed hat and everything else. And he started chatting to him. And he said to him, well, where are you from? And he said, London. And he said, yeah, London in Canary. He said, no, 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 London in the UK. To cut a long story short, he was Dickens's brother. So again, you just, what? How does that happen? He also then went down to Washington and met members of the Senate, including the president, Buchanan. And he had met Buchanan a few years earlier in Glasgow and was completely shocked at the transition in his appearance. And obviously, the impending civil war had a traumatic effect on him, president. And he met other famous people there, including Ralph Sims of the Alabama, and I'll discuss that very briefly. But again, famous people that he'd met out there before the war. So he learned a lot about going out to the northern states before the war. He didn't go to the southern states. Now remember, his ships were trading dramatically, big time, with both north and south, either with cotton and tobacco in the south, or wheat and cereal from the north. But what he thought was that, and it's pretty obvious, that the north was industrialized, the south was agricultural, and he was rather taken aback to see that the southerners were being more heavily taxed than the north. And basically, to sort of understand that, he was saying, if you've got a given piece of land, let's take an acre, you may have in the north, I don't know, say 100 people on that given area. But in the south, you may have significantly less, say 50 or even less. But you were taxed not by person, but by land. And so the northerners had more of a share and less tax compared to the south. And in addition to that, they had less representation in the Senate. And he felt that was rather unfair. So he supported the South. And I had no idea again about this. I've mentioned the more taxation and the less representation. But he was also very big on free trade. And of course, the South was very much involved in free trade, but not the North. They were protectionists and taxed their goods. He mentions again that the Confederates went to seek some sort of agreement with the government before the war, but the government refused to see them. And that happened about 2 or 3 times when the representatives went and they were just turned away. Obviously, the cotton supply for the north of England, so the north heavily relied on cotton. But he was also a committed pacifist, and he wanted the war to end as soon as possible. He didn't want cousin to fight with cousin. Again, remember his upbringing on the Christian side. One of the things I picked up in the diaries was this unwritten thing about the USA growing too powerful, which threatened British superiority, if you like. He could see the potential of the states, which could threaten Britain, and therefore a division actually would work in our favor. And it's an unwritten thing that I picked up. And others have. And he wasn't pro-slavery anyway. And to give you an idea, during the train trips, there were significant events. So to give you 2 examples, there was a black guy who got on the train in the first class where Lindsay was, and everyone on the train said, sorry, you're going into third. And they insisted, including the guards, black guy who was, I think it was a solicitor or something, had to go down in third. The other event, again, he mentions was a lady came on, black lady with a daughter, a baby, and no one would give their seat up for them. He moved his luggage across, she sat down, and the baby played with him on his knee, and everyone was aghast. So he had seen prejudice in the North as much as the South. And one of the things that came across is, as you probably know, Abraham Lincoln said he didn't want to get involved in slavery at the start of the war. So when he was claimed president, that's what he said in his speech. He didn't want to get involved in it. That came later, as we know. I picked this up fairly recently, a couple of months ago. I don't know if you saw this. This is, when I say a couple of months ago, this is June last year. Most Americans think slavery was the primary issue in the American Civil War, and then broke down into reasons. States' rights came out quite high in white Americans and Democrats and Republicans. So slavery was obviously very high on the agenda as to why the American Civil War had, well, that was the primary issue. But straight states' rights was quite high as well. And that is today. That's what people think now. I hope we'll have a discussion on that. Meanwhile, it was all kicking off in France because the French and the emperor there had built the first ironclad, La Gloire, which came out in 1860. So we came out with our Warrior shortly afterwards in 1861. This is a much better ship than Gloire, but it already started the ironclads. And Lindsay met with the emperor primarily to talk about navigation law, but then during the war discussed the blockade and other things as well, including recognition. So as you probably know, the Southern Commissioners in the first instance were these three, and Frank Osley, who's a historian, said probably about the worst possible choice of three people coming across. There were, particularly Yanis, was very, very pro-slavery in the South, and he met Lindsay. But it all kicked off, as you know, in April '61. And he gave a talk in Sunderland, basically saying that Russell, Home Secretary, should, or the Foreign Secretary, sorry, should acknowledge the Southern Confederation as an independent power. And this was reported in the press, went out to the States, and the States picked it up. And so he started getting hate letters to him. Enclosed fine sample of hemp used in America for hanging traitors. And then he said there really was a sample of hemp. So he wrote to Gladstone in May '61, saying that they are a nation, the Confederates. He felt that there was a complete separation between North and South in thinking, etc., etc. And then Gladstone's talk the following year mentions that actually they have made a nation. So the Southerners have made an army, they're making, it appears, a navy, they have made a nation. And that really caused a furore in the government, that speech. But it may hark back to Lindsay and his connection with Gladstone. So you all know about the Trent affair. And that was really, really close to us being at war with the Northerners. The two emissaries who came out, Mason and Slidell, were captured from our ship, the Trent, HMS Trent, and this was an uproar because how dare a US Navy ship enter onto our ship and take prisoners. These were taken out, as you probably know, to the States and held in prison. Lincoln, after a while, then let free. In the meantime, Slidell's wife and two daughters were put up in Lindsay's house, Shepperton Manor. So there's a real close connection between the old boy and the powers. So these were the sort of the government, liberal government at the time. And you've got Lord Russell, Foreign Secretary. He was pro-intervention to a certain extent, and basically he kept to that. And certainly, well, Gladstone, I mentioned, was by and large pro-independence, although he again wanted to sit on the fence and not cause problems. The Prime Minister, Palmerston, was very cautious. He didn't really want to come in on either side. And the diplomatic turning point, because basically Prime Minister Palmerston said, right, it's not unless we see things really moving battle-wise in the States before we can actually decide. And of course, Antoinette in September '62, that really was the turning point. And then there were other examples of it not working for the Southerners. So he was, the government were reluctant to get involved in supporting the South. Lindsay got involved with a parliamentary motion, which he was going to put forward, but actually didn't come to fruition, saying with a view of terminating hostilities between the contending parties, but it was withdrawn. So he as a pacifist, he still wanted the war to stop. You've got the Southern Independence Association being formed to harness support for the South, consisting of many members of Parliament and a few peers. And this is Alexander Beresford Hope, who was basically set this up, and Lindsay was a strong mover in that. If you want to know more about that, Charles's book mentions Alexander Beresford Hope quite specifically. Chapter 1, I think. Chapter 1. So, you put it into context. I think one of the problems that we had as a nation was, okay, well, if we recognize the South, what happens to Canada? Well, the northern states attack Canada. So we had to think, right, okay, how are we going to protect Canada, and is it worth it? And these were the movers and shakers, as I explained. Russia was basically sitting on the fence and didn't want to know. Lindsay, on 4 occasions, went to see the Emperor, Napoleon III, and they started off, as I mentioned, navigation law. Then they went on to blockade, and Napoleon said the blockade's not worth the paper it's written on. It's not effective, and therefore we can basically say, you know, we can recognise the Southern states. But he was reluctant to do that, and again, you've got to think about the ironclads that were going on in France, Britain. So Napoleon spoke to Lindsay, told him, right, okay, can you get the message across that I would be prepared to recognise the South? This is back in April '62. I'd be prepared to recognise the South if the British government would do the same, act in accord. So Lindsay fed back to Russell, and Russell said, who are you? You know, you can't come. You're not the ambassador. I will only talk to the ambassador, Lord Cowley. So there's a block there. So Lindsay went back to Napoleon and said, sorry, no dice. You need to speak to Lord Cowley. Of course, the Emperor wasn't happy with that. He also learned through a certain Tory, Disraeli, that there probably was a secret pact going on between the British government and the northern states, to the effect that we would not recognise the South. And that was a sort of an unwritten understanding that he picked up from Disraeli. Disraeli was quite keen to try and get Lindsay involved in his government, in Tory, reading between the lines. Okay, so the navies. The North had obsolete ships. They had many more because the South had none. They had to build a navy. had no. The North had a command that was elderly and promoted on length of service. They had bureaucratic decisions which slowed the whole thing down. Too few young men. Politicians wanted to actually downsize the Navy because there were no wars going on and there was lack of use. This was just before the war. They had 40 ships to implement 4,000-mile blockade, which was almost possible, but they did their best. And they obviously had good industrial facilities if they were going to. The South, they had to build a navy, so they turned into modern warships. They had very limited building facilities. Several officers joined from the Naval Academy, joined from the Navy to the Confederate cause. They had to run the blockade to export cotton. They needed smokeless coal, which again comes back to that coal aspect. And the main feature of this is they knew that they could not contest the American Navy. So what they did, the Confederate Navy, was to attack merchant ships, not the Navy, just merchant ships, to stymie things for the North. As you know, this was a blockade all around the coastline. And they split off into different theatres. And this was the North. They had a blockading squadron in the North Atlantic, South Atlantic, East Gulf, and West Gulf. And what the Confederates were trying to do was to come into Bermuda, to Nassau in the Bahamas, and to Havana in Cuba. So there'd be transatlantic ships coming into there, and then you'd have blockade runners primarily going from there to try and get hold of cotton. So, as you may or may not know, Bullock came over here to try and raise the Confederate Navy, build the Navy here in Britain. So what they did was, this again is a quote from Mason to Mallory, so he was in charge of the Confederate Navy. Through this house, bonds for the delivery of cotton were negotiated to the amount of £60,000 for the use of the Navy Department. And that was Lindsay. Lindsay raised through his connections £60,000 to kick things off in building the Navy. Mason quoted Lindsay, "Mr. Lindsay told me he would undertake through himself and connections to furnish from £250,000 to £500,000 in sterling." Wasn't only the 60,000, he was thinking big time. This was a letter from Lindsay. This is November 62 to Mason. I won't go all through this, but of course these are some of the ships that were built by the Confederate Navy, and more importantly, the Union merchant ships that were lost. And the Alabama claimed 69. You also had others like the CSS Florida, and also the Shenandoah, which is later on. I haven't got time to go through it all, but they were beginning to get places, and then the government basically stopped it, as you probably know, with the building of the layered rams, which they put a stop to. I mentioned Lindsay had met Raphael Sims of the Alabama. This is he. He visited Lindsay's mansion several times. He was quite friendly with him and wrote to him after the war. And we all know Charles has talked, I think, about this, about the battle between the Alabama and Kearsarge at Sherburne. That was the end of that one. And then, of course, this was the state of the art. This is what the Confederates were building. This is the stone wall, which never actually got going, but it was being built in France as a ram, ironclad ram. I mean, it was quite advanced in its day. And the idea of these was to really caused havoc with the Navy, who were protecting the blockade. One thing I'm not talking about, because it's not home ground, this is what's happening over in the States, the monitors. We didn't build monitors here. This is all out in the States. I'm not going to touch on that. So it was getting very hot for Lindsay. He decided, right, I'm going to sell my company to my two partners, Stringer and Pembroke. They had to pay enough. There wasn't enough money, so they had another person, James Galbraith, up in Scotland, to join them. And they got involved heavily in blockade running with arms and equipment, big time. And in the book, you'll see a list of ships that were owned by the partners and merchant trading companies, what they were. So to give you an idea, a captain running a blockade would earn about £1,000. You could, as an organisation running a blockade runner, could earn a profit of about $150,000, which is a heck of a lot in those days. In the early days, you're getting nearly 97% success rate getting through the blockade, and even in 64, the evasion rate was about 72. So you'd get quite a good return if you went for it. This is a cotton bond. Lindsay was very much instrumental in helping that get off the ground. But in the papers, it said that he had £20,000 worth of cotton bonds. And Lindsay contested that and said, no, it was only 2,000. Well, in the diaries, actually, I found it was £4,000, but there was an additional $65,000. So this is about $2.5 million days money that he'd invested in bonds. I can highly recommend these books, particularly this one. This is Merley, Great Britain and Confederate Navy. But there are other ones as well, Hubbard, Burden and Confederate Diplomacy, and of course, Homegrown. Very useful books. To give you an idea, I mean, Lindsay was so hopeful that the South were going to get recognition that he proposed to the South that if the war was successful, he would run a shipping line to these places. So he would already called it the Transatlantic Steam Navigation. So he was already thinking ahead of, okay, how can I help doing that? Now, I want to touch on slavery because this is what Lincoln said is in an inaugural address in March '61. I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery wherein it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so. This did not go down well over here in this country with those that wanted emancipation. Obviously, it changed significantly in January '63 when we had the emancipation. But Lindsay abhorred slavery. As I mentioned, he was a Christian and he was a pacifist. His experience in the Liverpool docks, I want to touch very briefly on that. He had no employment, no food, no shelter. And he thought, if all the slaves, 2 million of them, were released at once, would they have employment, food, and shelter? And he preferred a gradual release from slavery. He also deserted in Demerara, and he lived on a plantation with slaves for a couple of weeks. So he had actually experienced it. I mentioned it, he observed discrimination, and he had assurances from the Confederates that they would grant slavery over time, freedom to slaves over time. So the big question is, what would have happened if Southern had independence had happened? Would there have been a war with Europe? May well have been. The North would have been threatened on all sides, Canada and from us and from France as well. It may threat the lessons of naval supremacy to us. In other words, because there would be two nations, it would not, as I mentioned before, threaten the British Empire so much. What would happen about emancipation? And what about the French? Would they exploit this? Anyway, it all changed dramatically when 5 days before his 49th birthday, he had a stroke. He was lucky to survive it. This is just before the end of the war. And so he became an author. Those are the books that he published, including The History of Merchant Shipping in 4 volumes, which is like a Bible in its day. He sold all his ships and built a holiday house down in Bournemouth, and those for the 18 bedrooms and 43 apartments, no small little house that. And he died, as I mentioned, this is in Shepperton, this is his tomb. And just to end on the fact that in 1868, a book was published, and in that book are people like Disraeli and others, Dickens. And it says of Lindsay, a poor friendless orphan, cabin boy, great ship owner, a member of Parliament. Why it seems a fable, it seems too improbable to be true, but it is true nevertheless. And I'm going to end there. That's the book.